across the other part of the world, as I'm doing right now. In other words, the ability to engage in activities off the at home are completely different. But there's also going to be issues here with simply the health consequences of COVID. All right. So the first idea is going to be that you have substantial heterogeneity in mortality. You have substantial heterogeneity in economic consequences. The third stylized fact is going to be inequalities and the consequences of the income losses. So in other words, it's one thing to say that there's heterogeneity in, people lose different amounts of money or income because of COVID. There's another question as to what the consequences are. And so here, the sorts of statistics one would like to look at are difficulty paying bills, running into dangers of not being able to pay rents or mortgages, and limits to being able to pay for medical care. And again, if you look at those statistics, you see very different numbers depending on ethnicity, age, and education. And obviously, and the self-evident one is going to be income itself. So the upshot is to say that even in an extremely advanced economy such as the United States, with very developed credit markets, it's not a matter that individuals are necessarily easily able to borrow against future income and smooth over these types of losses. And so, as is well understood from the literature on consumption in the United States, there's many credit-constrained families, and so that's manifesting itself now. All right. The fourth stylized fact was also alluded to, and that is that there's a separate impact on education. So in other words, the first three statistics I gave you are arguments that if you think of families as units in which the parents have some defined budget set in terms of their opportunities to do things, that you have substantial inequality in the effects of COVID, and mortality in some senses is just not to trivialize it because of the psychological harms, but as a way of understanding how those opportunity sets for the families are themselves constrained. Stylized fact 4 has to do with thinking about inequality in education. And so this is the statistic that was alluded to and is fundamental, which is asking whether or not children have access to computers or tablets for schoolwork. What you see, of course, is that there's most people in the United States do, regardless of family income, but nevertheless, the fraction that do not is essentially nothing for $100,000 per year. But if you're in the in between below 50, then you start to see meaningful numbers. And so in the United States, where one thinks of the poverty rate as 12% for the sake of argument, saying that these types of numbers become meaningful. All right, so what's the final thing I would want to say about heterogeneity? And that is that there's heterogeneity in health responses. In other words, it's one thing to say that the health consequences are different across individuals. It's a second thing to say that the economic effects are different across families. The second thing would be, so first to say mortality differs across families in ways that are associated with socioeconomic characteristics of the families. The second would be to say economics has the same phenomena. The third was to say that educational inputs to children have been affected. And the final simply to say that the extent to which families are protecting themselves with respect to health also exhibits substantial differences. So here's a very interesting table. This is asking about how frequently people are willing to wear masks. And so what you find in the United States is that you have extraordinary heterogeneity in mask usage. So if you look at these numbers, the things I would again point out here are huge differences in the willingness of men and women to wear masks in the United States. First order political differences. And somewhat more modest educational differences. And finally, interestingly enough, a greater willingness among the less affluent. So why would I put this final thing on the table? Well, I'm going to put it on for several reasons. One of them is that in understanding why the United States has had such a dismal record with respect to COVID, a part of the explanation is going to be that the willingness to use masks here has been extremely unimpressive. And furthermore, that's a different type of heterogeneity across families. It's not so associated with education or income. It seems to be associated with ideology. And so the upshot is that I can think about families in which there's heterogeneity with respect to parental income. I can think about families with respect to heterogeneity in ethnic group and race, which is the salient categories in the United States. I can think about families that differ with respect to income. I could think about an education, and I would then have to think about ideology. In other words, why is there some association with certain types of health activities with political beliefs? So those are what I mean by the facts. In other words, that the first thing to do in asking the question, what are the consequences of intergenerational mobility from COVID, is to simply identify the dimensions along which these effects are happening. And so one then wants to divide them into different categories. One are the direct health consequences. Okay, mortality is one example of it. Obviously, the fact of being sick, and I should have put up those numbers as well, which means income loss from families, is going to do exactly the same thing. Another thing that's going to happen is family resources, which are relevant to the input sick children are going to be affected. Another is going to be that educational opportunities are directly hurt. And the final thing is that families are going to exhibit some heterogeneity with reference to how they're responding to COVID. So those are the facts. And so then the second thing I want to do in the talk is give you, a set of heuristics to think through the question of how would one translate the facts, which we know, into predictions about intergenerational mobility. All right, is everybody with me on that? So in thinking about that, I want to actually precede this with an observation, and that is there's a standard statistical model of intergenerational mobility. So if somebody says this society is more mobile than that society, somebody says Germany is more mobile than the United States, which it is substantially, what they're saying is that people have taken data which have compared the logarithm of some measure of parental income, the logarithm of child income, offspring income, and they've run a linear regression, and they have focused on this coefficient beta. That's called the intergenerational elasticity of income, and it answers the question, if I raise a parent's income by 1%, what is the predicted effect percentage-wise on the child? All right. Well, so when somebody makes the statement, as I made an assertion, I said it's a fact that Germany has more mobility than the U.S. What that means in the empirical literature is that the beta for the United States is substantially higher than the beta for Germany. All right. Now, the reason I put this on the table is that asking what are the consequences for intergenerational mobility, there's really two things you have to think about. And what I mean by that is the first question is, suppose you take family incomes. I take a rich family and a poor family, and I simply were to move the gap between them, increase the gap between them. If the intergenerational elasticity of income is a constant, then the predicted difference between the children of the rich family and the poor family will increase. So in other words, there is an immediate logic that says that if family resources help determine the income of children, if I increase the gap between rich and poor, that's going to increase in expectation and predictive power what we think the kids are going to look like. So that's the obvious one. The less obvious one is maybe beta itself is affected. So in other words, and this is where economic theory, come into play, is to say that if we're thinking about the transmission of parental socioeconomic status to children, the way you operationalize it, mathematically, is that you'll have some things you measure for the parent. And here I'm focusing on income, and you say that income of the parent helps determine the income of the child. And so what one has to understand is not only how income gaps between parents and children, if they widen today, will change the predictions for the future, given the economic structure. But second, you have to ask whether or not this coefficient that links them has changed. And that's a big deal. All right. So that's really kind of the key message I want to put on the table is that in trying to do these predictions, there actually are two separate things you have to do. First, you have to measure the way that family disparities have increased in response to COVID. And second, you have to measure the way in which the responses of the way that family disparities translate into offspring disparities. Is that constant, or is that itself changing? All right, and so that makes that that's actually quite an important thing. Are there any questions on that? And so,
yeah, there is no question. Please carry on.
Okay, thank you. And how much more time do I have?
It may take another 10 minutes.
10 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry. I'm having I just want to. I don't want to mess up the next talk. So here's what I want to say.
Minutes,
There's a lot of algebra on these slides.
15 minutes you can take.
Yeah. All right. Your talk is much more interesting. So go ahead.
Well, by the way, that's an example of a statement that is modest, but I'm sure not accurate. And so it's virtuous, but not correct. but let me move on. Here's what I want to say, and that is that in trying to understand these two channels of mobility, you have to have a vision of how the economy works, how the society works. Okay, that's what economic theories do, and that's what formal models do. Is they give you a way of thinking about this transition of the gaps between rich and poor parents into the gaps of the children, and understanding both how the gap itself matters and both how the transition process is affected. And so the literature on intergenerational mobility has a set of theories that try to instantiate those relationships. All right, and so and just to give you, the kind of the history of this, I think is to say that there's a set of classical models of intergenerational mobility that were developed in the 1970s and early 1980s. And what those models do is they look at the effect of parental investments on. The metaphor in the models is that parents have incomes. Those incomes constrain what they do for their children. And as a result, the higher a parent's income, the more they can do for their kids, and hence the better the kids are going to do in labor markets afterwards. I will add that these models have tended to be, let's say, the theoretical literature does have a dichotomy in it, and that is I'm going to talk about the models that were largely developed in the United States. And I'm laughing a little bit because an interesting distinction is that the models of intergenerational mobility that are, I'm calling them American-based, tend to focus on the role of education, on human capital. In other words, they reflect the idea of the American dream, that people who have skills going to the labor market are going to do really well. Many of the European models focus on something else. They focus on inheritance, the idea that wealth and the income generated from wealth is what is determining the levels of intergenerational mobility. And so it's not that one is right or wrong. It's just I myself have written in a certain tradition, and you should be aware that tradition reflected some cultural background. So even though the models might look scientific and mathematical, they have cultural assumptions in them. All right, in saying all that, basically the idea is going to be the following. Okay, as I said, I'm going to really try to cut to the chase. So an idea would basically say the following, that what happens is the parents have incomes, and they use the incomes partially to invest in their children, and they use the incomes partially to consume things. So the first idea would be that a child develops human capital. In other words, so I have my children. They had a certain level of skills they brought to a labor market. And so the algebra of that would say that they brought those skills to the labor market and they were determined by two things. The first thing they were determined by is luck. In other words, heterogeneity. You think of that as latent abilities. Some people are born with different talents, different abilities than others, and those are going to matter for the skills one brings to a market. The second thing that matters is going to be this investment. So the I is the investment that a parent makes. Now, the thought experiment is that parents have incomes, and part of those incomes go to educational investments, and those educational investments are help producing these skills, the human capital that is produced in the children. All right, it's a very elementary idea. Now, this is a statement about the nature of the technology in the society. All right. One comment to make is notice that this is not a model of public schools. It's a model of education in which the parental income is constraining educational opportunities. We want to talk about the extent to which that's delimiting. All right, there's going to be a bunch of assumptions. They're not interesting. The second idea, however, is going to be that if you want to know what the income of a child is, that's going to be the income of an adult. And so what this notation says is you look at family I, an adult, and generational T+1. Well, that was determined by the human capital that child received growing up, the skills that were produced through a combination of investments in the child and the initial heterogeneity, as well as something else. There's more luck. That's labor market luck. And so, if they're, people can be fortunate, more or less fortunate in terms of what job opportunities they hear about. If you have the Silicon Valley and a bunch of people are trying to develop a language for laser printers in the 1980s, one of the companies called Adobe won. The other ones all lost. And so you can think about many different contexts in which there's something called luck that's going to matter. All right. And then the final thing to say is there's going to be some relationship between the investment a child receives and the income that the parent has. So the first two things I gave you, I called them technologies. There's some process by which investments in children produce human capital. There's some technical relationship that determines how human capital translates into actual income. But the other thing is going to be a choice. Parents make choices. Now, I didn't write down any fancy utility maximization, the usual suspects in economics, because you don't need to. The only thing that matters is that the parent's income constrains the investments. So the upshot is, here is an extremely ugly equation which describes intergenerational mobility. And that is, it's a composite function of the rules for family investments, the process by which human capital is formed, and the process by which human capital determines income. So that's a theory of intergenerational mobility. It's all very intuitive. And I just want to say one thing about it. It's not linear, except in very special cases. And this is one of the messages I want to have at the end. And that is, when you think about this process by which heterogeneity and the COVID effects of income are going to matter, heterogeneity and the ability of parents to compensate for the fact that learning has to be done at home, is going to be some nonlinear transformation of that heterogeneity into the eventual economic consequences for the children when they grow up. And nonlinearity is a big deal. If you think about phenomena such as poverty traps, or what in my own research I've called affluence traps, those are nonlinear phenomena. The idea that families, if they have sufficiently low incomes, they're trapped. It's extremely unlikely their kids are going to be other than poor. The other side of that is if families are rich enough, it's extremely unlikely their kids, at least in this country, are not going to be rich as well. But those are nonlinear things you have to think about. All right, and so the upshot is the predictions on how much intergenerational mobility is going to be affected, you have to know what these functional relationships are. And the more nonlinear they are, the less information will come from that statistical model, which was a linear model. Okay, now where's the kind of the frontier of the literature? It really has to do with two ideas. And I'm going to talk about two papers, one I wrote, and so you know that's going to sound self-serving, but there's a point there that I think is useful. Where the literature has evolved is simply to say, well, you know what, it's not just family income that matters, other things matter. So one idea, and this would be a paper by Gary Becker and three distinguished co-authors, which was published after Becker died, basically would say the following, and that is the human capital that children have, it depends on the investments that parents make, but it depends on something else. It depends on the educational levels of the parents. And the idea there's going to be a complementarity there. So highly educated parents, their investments have more bang for buck than less educated parents. All right, and there's ample empirical evidence of that. So from the perspective of the mathematical framework I gave you, this idea is simply adding a variable to one of the functions. But that variable is extremely important because that adds more nonlinearity in the system. And what it says specifically is that if you fix the educational levels of two different parents, the rich one's going to do even better than the poor one, their kids at least, because of the complementarity. The second thing it says is that the income effects of COVID are going to be interacting with the educational heterogeneity of the parents. So if less educated parents are hurt more by income than highly educated parents, it's a double whammy in terms of exacerbating and increasing persistence of socioeconomic status between generations. Okay, so the other model I want to talk about, and this is one that I've developed in a set of papers, and most recently I did in work that was co-authored with Anant Seshadri, was to say that maybe we should think about things. Let me go up here and just say, and think about social models of mobility. After all, it might matter that education in most societies is largely a public good. And so in the United States, to make it concrete, the idea would be that people go to something, well, this is in every country. You say it's the same thing. There are schools, and those schools have components that are financed by governments. And so what matters, therefore, is not just what your parents' income is, it's where you grow up. And so the upshot is, again, you can just cut through a bunch of algebra. You have to go through all this stuff to write down a mathematical model that's internally coherent, blah, 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 is that what's going to determine the human capital of children is going to be the community income they grow up in. This is just the distribution of incomes in the community. You need to know something about the size of the community. And that's what is going to determine things. And so what happens in models like this is very intuitive. And that is that, again, if you ask me what's the main thing I purchased for my children in terms of education, the answer is a school district. So in other words, that families purchase locations to give them access to different schools, or they can be private schools. And if it's a public case, there'll be rules for the assignment of students to them, and you purchase memberships in the schools. What's happening in these models, in other words, is if it's in social models of intergenerational mobility, what matters is the extent to which the children of the rich and poor are segregated from each other. In a model where families do all the investment, by definition, the rich and poor are in different families. There's complete segregation. Once you account for education as a public good and have schools which have many students, what matters is the extent to which you have socioeconomic segregation of schools. And of course, in the United States, it's not just income, it's also race. What happens once again is you end up with first order nonlinearities introduced in these models. So why do I keep mentioning nonlinearities? Because this is going to be the key thing I want to say at the end, and that is, I think in understanding the effects of COVID, the way one has to proceed is to think about something called the Great Gatsby curve. The Great Gatsby curve is named after the book The Great Gatsby. I think that's for that gives it some cachet, but it's not useful. It basically makes the following observation, and that is, if you look across various countries that are more unequal also have lower rates of mobility. This is literally what the curve is. It takes a measure of the Gini coefficients for different countries, and it compares it to that intergenerational elasticity number. All right. Now, I'm sorry I could not find an example of a diagram that had India in it, but the main thing I would make an observation about is that what it suggests is that countries that are highly unequal tend to be less mobile. That's the regularity here. And while this is done for countries, the same phenomena exists at different levels of aggregation. Okay, it's been identified for regions of the United States to some extent in work that I'm currently participating in. There's evidence of it for Denmark. I will put a conjecture that it may matter for regions and states of India. And so one of the messages I want on the table is I think the way to think about the mobility consequences of COVID is you have to identify different regions which have, are defined by having common school, production of education, common governments, and that can be at different levels of aggregation, and then ask the extent to which they exhibit different levels of changes in cross-sectional inequality from COVID, and then from that, using that fancy algebra I used before, you would pull out what the changes are in the beta coefficient, the degree of mobility. So let me just end with 3 comments. The first thing is that in thinking about intergenerational mobility and all these models I talked about, which, at the end of the day, the thing you want to measure is something called bottlenecks. In other words, are there configurations of the socioeconomic status of parents where it's really hard for the kids to do well? And there are mathematical tools to do that. And that's kind of where the frontier of the measurement literature is. The second message is that linear analyses of the effects of COVID on intergenerational mobility are likely to be highly misleading. In other words, that I gave you kind of a typology of different theories of how you would map my 5 stylized facts into mobility. And the thing I wanted to say is, outside of saying, well, a bunch of unreadable algebra where I didn't define any of the subscripts, is to say that these are deeply nonlinear systems. And so the linear models are misleading. And the third thing, of course, is just to end it by saying this is not mutable. Policy matters. The rules that determine the funding of schools, for example, that's a policy choice. And so at the end of the day, as I said, I think that in asking what the mobility effects are from COVID, that's going to be, that's not something that I want to take a stance on, because you have to take a stance on how governments are going to respond. So with that, let me finish.
Thank you, Professor Stephen, for the interesting and inciting presentation on global income inequality. And with this, it is my great pleasure to invite Professor Stephen Kloner from Heidelberg University, Germany. About him, he is Professor of Development Economics at South Asia Institute, Heidelberg University. He earned a master's PhD in economics from the Ruprecht Karls University, Heidelberg. Previously, he has held various positions at Yale University, Cornell University, and Professor of International and Development Economics at Goethe University, Frankfurt. Its research focuses on microeconomic aspect of low-income economies like developing countries like India, in particular, credit insurance, health poverty targeting, and impact evaluation of welfare programs. His regional specialization is South India, so where he has carried out several data collection and field studies. So thank you, Professor Stephen, for your valuable time, for giving valuable times. So it's over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to speak in this distinguished session. Can you hear me reasonably well?
Yes,
yeah.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
And you can also see my slides?
Yes, yeah, clearly.
Okay, that's perfect. So I will proceed the other way around as the previous speaker. I'm first going to talk a little about poverty and poverty measurement in general, and then show you some more secular pre-COVID developments in those figures for India. And then I'm going to move on to some of my own work on the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act and its effects on poverty reduction in India. And then I will come to COVID and discuss some work of my co-author on the NREGA impact evaluation work on some recent trends in the NREGA under COVID. So that's the plan here. And I plan to go for 30 minutes. Is that right, Jagannath? Yeah, okay. All right, so yeah, just some general background on poverty. So you know, this is on the kind of global development agenda as manifested by the so-called Millennium Development Goals by the United Nations, which were for the period 1990 to 2015, where it says poverty should be halved, and we will see whether India actually achieved that. And also more recently for the Sustainable Development Goals, which are currently in place, that say end this poverty in all its forms everywhere, which of course sounds very ambitious. And the indicators that are specified here are to eradicate this $1.25 a day poverty. So I'll come to that concept in a second. And so definitions of poverty, so really how should we think of that, is typically and traditionally, one would say, with a focus on material well-being and in particular consumption. And actually India has been sort of a pioneer in terms of conceptualizing and measuring poverty. I'll get to that. So think of consumption of a household as just the physical basket of goods and services which it consumes in a given time period, like 30 days. So yeah, could think of it as this shopping cart. And then you essentially just put a price tag on each of these items and add it up, and that gives you the value of consumption. Okay, so what's important for how poverty is generally measured, especially in low and middle income contexts, it's not about income, it's about consumption. And so of course part of that is, for example, food consumption. And yeah, if you have a lot on your plate, you have more consumption and you're less likely to be poor. And this is how this is done in India. So here you can see an excerpt of the Indian National Sample Survey's questionnaire, where they go every 5 years to about 120,000 households and ask them for essentially on what we would call a positive list. So they ask them for about 500 consumption items, and then they enter both the quantity and the value and just add all that up, and that gives the value of consumption then. That's that. And for international poverty comparisons, which are, well, not so pressing here, actually there are some people sitting in DC with a World Bank in Washington in the United States and make these figures comparable, because the figures on this NSS questionnaire would of course be in rupees, but for other countries in Africa it would, for example, be some kind of franc. Now, what do living standards look like? So yeah, the extreme poverty line is at $1.25, actually now revised upward to $1.90 in current prices. And there's a great website called Gapminder, which gives you photos of living standards of households in different countries of the world by their daily income or consumption. And so here on the left, you see a photo of a family living on $1.60 per day, and on the right you see the living quarters of a family with $4.40. I believe both of them are from South Asia. And what you can also see is here families that are poor here consume fewer calories, so they are less likely to be well nourished. They only consume around 2,000 calories in India, while the non-poor consume 2,300 in rural areas. And most striking is the food share. So if you're poor in India, you spend about 60% of your consumption basket on food items, while the non-poor spend only 26%. So this is really a dramatic difference. Good. Just briefly, poverty reduction up to 2015. So if you go back to 1990, sort of before the steady growth started in India, but also China, South and East Asia, and in East Asia, it's for the most part China contributed most to the world's poor. So this is the number of people living under this extreme poverty line of what is now $1.90, and China has virtually eradicated that kind of poverty by 2015, and India is on a good track. So South Asia, here the population is mostly India. You can see while they contributed about 80% to world poverty previously, they now only contribute about a third, and the bulk of poor people is now actually living in sub-Saharan Africa, where the number of poor people has even increased since 1990. The poverty rate there went slightly down, but since there is population growth, the number of poor has been increasing. And now these are poverty rates, and you can see that there's quite an impressive record in terms of bringing poverty down. So if we start again in 1990, world poverty rate was about 50%, and it's now down to 10%. So sort of since the beginning of the Millennium Development Goals, quite a large success. But actually mostly driven by China, where 1 billion people is living. Good, so just some global figures. So those are some recent figures. This is in 1990, and you can see that, India has been there, and those are more recent figures, and you can see a big difference for China, which moved from dark red to green, while India sort of moved from orange to pink. Good. Alternative approaches to measure poverty is an alternative measure is the Multidimensional Poverty Index, pushed by a team at Oxford University. So rather than focusing on consumption, they focus on 3 categories, which are also in the Human Development Index, and essentially assess the living standards of a household according to those 3 categories, which are then measured by 10 variables. And if there's a shortfall of a minimum standard in enough of these categories, a household is then classified as multidimensionally poor. So what's the difference conceptually? We would say consumption is a flow, so which at a certain point in time kind of passes through your household, while in multidimensional poverty it's more about a state, a stock of affairs. But as it turns out, actually, if you look at the evolution of consumption poverty and multidimensional poverty, it turns out that they give very similar answers. So this is just from a UN report, and they sort of depicted 3 countries here, which I've reproduced, and you see the multidimensional poverty index is either the purple or the red line, and the consumption poverty here, which comes closest to that, is at the national monetary poverty, so it's these bluish lines. So you can see that for these countries here, Sierra Leone, Pakistan, Colombia, the trends in consumption poverty and multidimensional poverty are in fact very similar. So yeah, for assessing general poverty trends, they seem to give similar answers, and I'll come to the numbers for India in a second, where this is also true. Gonna skip that. Okay, so coming to India's poverty reduction record. So those are some figures from work by Martin Ravalian and Gaurav Dutt, who used to work for the World Bank and did plenty of important work on poverty in India. You can see that, so this is at the national poverty rate, which is actually quite close to the international dollar a day standard, the so-called Lakdawala poverty line, the traditional one. So poverty, rural poverty was around 60% for quite a long time, sort of up until the 1980s, and then afterward started to decline quite rapidly, and then in 2010 was at about 12 to 15%. And urban poverty started out a little lower, has also come down. What we also observe now over, so sort of since 2005 is a convergence of rural and urban poverty rates in India. Well, you're more familiar with that than I am, I'm sure. So if you think of the different phases of India's political regimes since independence, it seems that the kind of those periods of the start with Nehru and then Indira Gandhi were not so successful in bringing down poverty, while the liberalization regime since the 1980s with ensuing economic growth, where poverty has been greatest. So this is for the 1990s. So you see in this belt, Bihar, Jharkhand and Orissa, we've had poverty rates of around 60% and much less in, for example, Kerala. Now, this has become much better according to the latest data, which unfortunately by now is 10 years old for India. So still there is a regional concentration of poverty in the northeast, but the rates have come down quite a bit. So they are now at 30 to 40% rather than 60% there, and in states like Kerala and Rajasthan, poverty has even come down to between 5 and 20%. What about the current state of poverty in India? So this is a little embarrassing, especially for us researchers, because the poverty is calculated from national sample surveys, and usually those happen every 5 years. And the last consumption survey that took part in 2017-18 is not being revealed by the government. So people say because it shows poverty figures that are not favorable. So some methodological issues have been pointed to, but it's a really big pity because for researchers, I mean, apart from sort of the levels of consumption and poverty rates, there's of course a lot of wealth that is in these data. So yeah, there's actually a petition which I've also signed to release these data, but it's not coming. Just wait a second. So sorry, this is my daughter starting her homeschooling this morning. Good, so therefore the 2010-11 data is the latest information we have available, and so we really don't know what happened in the last decade, which would of course be very important to know. Okay, so what about multidimensional poverty? So the nice thing is that more recent figures are available for multidimensional poverty. So this is based on a different survey, which is called the National Family Health Survey, and the last one has been fielded in 2015-16. And so if you remember the previous plot I showed you on this consumption poverty, the pattern is very similar, right? So you sort of have these northeastern pockets where poverty is rampant, and then especially towards the south and the southwest. So Kerala, you have very low rates of poverty. So fortunately, this survey has been made public, and I also work with those data myself. Just hold on for a second. All right. Can you still see my screen? Yeah. Okay. So those are the changes in multidimensional poverty, and this is kind of good news. So because on the horizontal axis you see the state of poverty in 2005-06, and on the vertical axis you see the poverty reduction. And you see this downward sloping line. So now I'm thinking of Steve Durloff's transition and convergence models. But the kind of bright side of this downward sloping pattern is that states that started with high poverty rates actually experienced most of the reduction. So as you can see, Bihar and Jharkhand here that started at about 45% poverty rate actually had a reduction of about 20 percentage points. So they were actually able to halve the poverty, while states that had been doing better at the beginning, like the Punjab here have a reduction of 8%. So sort of there is actually massive poverty reduction here regarding multidimensional poverty. And we would, of course, be curious what this looks like with consumption poverty. Okay, how to reduce poverty in general? Well, you can just grow the size of the cake that is available in the economy. So that's economic growth. The other way is redistribution. So you redistribute more from the non-poor to the to the poor. And so how has India achieved its poverty reduction? Just briefly, we all know there's been massive growth here. So you can see sort of from 1990 to 2018, I guess here the GDP per capita has roughly tripled. On the other hand, inequality has increased. So while, for example, under the Indira Gandhi era, during that era, inequality actually decreased, it has been increasing quite a bit since 1980. So on the right, you can see the top 1% income share. You know, those are the Tatas and the likes. So they had less than 10% of GDP in the 1980s, but now they have more than 20%. And the income share of the bottom 50% has come down from about 25% to just 15%. So despite this increase in inequality, it seems the growth effect has been dominant and brought down poverty. A third factor is urbanization. So you've seen, if you remember the first poverty charts, that urban poverty has traditionally been lower in India than rural poverty. So the share of urban population has been steadily increasing. So this also arguably has brought down poverty to some extent, even though urbanization is not as rapid as in China, for example, which is the dark blue line. Then finally, and what I'm personally interested in as a researcher is the effect of welfare programs on poverty reduction. And here one thing, there is sort of another important aspect of growth, and that is that it puts much more money into the government's pockets to spend on welfare. And so you can see here from 1990 to the most recent figures that the social expenditures in GDP increased from about 6 to 8%. And now, given that GDP also tripled, you know, this means that social expenditures more than tripled, like something like quadrupled. And this, of course, is also an important contributor to poverty reduction. So this is a paper by Jean Drèze and Ritika Kira, just sort of programs here. It's the midday meal program, the ICDS, the NREGA, the PDS, and the Social Security old age pensions. Sort of outreach you can see here. So it really reaches out to a large part of the population. So 29% of households in 2011 under NREGA and 50% by the PDS of households were reached by the PDS. So really large programs with a big coverage. And Jean Drèze also has a paper on the estimated impact of the PDS on rural poverty, and he arrives at the conclusion that it has reduced rural poverty by around 18%. And as you can see here, by state, even more so in states that have a high administrative capacity, so like Tamil Nadu, where the effect is even 61%. So there's a state where the PDS is especially big. Good. So end this talking a little about the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, on which I have some work, which is also featured on the ideas for India. So if you're interested, you can read my blog post there. I don't need to explain what this is about. The promise of 100 work days per household per year. In my own research, we're looking at the early days of the NREGA, so around 2007 when this was rolled out, and we just compare districts that got the program early with districts that got the program later. So we use this staggered rollout, and what we find in a nutshell is substantial effects on rural poverty during the spring season, also called the Rabi season, so which is traditionally the agricultural off-season. And we actually find large impacts there. So column 7, you can see the impact on the rural poverty rate. So this estimate is really large, 16 percentage points. It's about half of the rural poverty rate at this point in time. But this is only for states where the program was implemented with a high intensity. So for example, not Maharashtra, but Madhya Pradesh has been one of these states, and Rajasthan, where the NREGA has been very forceful, and there we see a strong effect. On the other hand, in the other states, in column 6 and 8, we don't see any effect. So what we conclude in our work is that sort of the intensity of implementation is really important, and there's the seasonal aspect. So even in those star states in column 5, for the fall, for the Kharif season, we don't see any effect. So it's all concentrated on the off season. Good. Then I'll come to the COVID and the NREGA. And so first, I guess my impression is there is not as much of a wealth of very recent data for India as there is for the US. So Steve Durloff benefited a little, of course, from the administrative data, which is available almost in real time for the US. So this is income and poverty data from administrative sources is not available, and surveys take time. And in the times of the pandemic, surveys are actually very difficult to field. So I guess, one of the best pieces of administrative data relevant for poor households is the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which has this online information system. And so this is some work of my co-author, Christian Oldiges, who has a recent paper on the NREGA under COVID-19. And so what you see is actually a massive expansion of the NREGA in 2020 during the first lockdown. So typically NREGA is more active in the spring season. And you can see here that both the number of person days generated and the proportion, the number of households reached in spring 2020 compared to previous years. Now, if you see here 40 million households, this is about every third or fourth rural household. So that's quite a lot. So in India, I guess, like back of the envelope, there would be around 120 million rural households, something on that order. And they showed that both the demand and the person days generated actually increased massively. So the faint lines are for the previous years, and the solid line, the black line, is for 2020. And as you can see here, again, both the demand sort of skyrocketed from about 100 in June, July up to 500. The supply did not go up by as much, but still almost to 400. So there was really also a supply response here. And of course, you all know these stories of the return migrants from the cities during the first lockdown to villages. So there was a huge demand for income generation in the villages. So is it the case that those that have a lot of migrants and then also, of course, return migrants get actually more of the work days? So this is rationing. So essentially, the percentage of demand not met by NREGA supply, and you can see here the high outmigration districts had higher rates of rationing. So it means that the effect of the NREGA as a safety net was limited. So those districts with a lot of migration would be in most need for work days, but they also experienced the highest rationing, while rationing was less in low migration districts. And so here are some shares of NREGA expansion between 2020 and 2019, and what they do, Aldrich and Narayan. So the other author is Sudha Narayan at the IGIDR in Mumbai. They decompose into an intensive margin and extensive margin. So the extensive margin is new households being reached, households that have not previously been reached. And you can see that UP has been quite successful here. So it reached almost around 60% more households than previously in 2020 with the NREGA, less so in southern states. But in the left panel, intensive margin means that households that are already in the NREGA, how many more person days they got, so how much longer they worked. And here you can see, for example, that Maharashtra has been successful, but UP not. So regionally, very different patterns. And this is, of course, always the thing with Indian social programs. Typically, they are administered by states. And so what states do with the federal funds is very heterogeneous. And so you also see here very different responses in the different states. And so for the overall person days, you can see, well, that neither Maharashtra nor UP actually had large increases, but that states, like Andhra Pradesh actually in the end had the greatest increases in overall NREGA activity. All right, so I'm coming close to the end. I've talked about the NREGA expansion in response to migration. Here you see a figure in response to poverty. So on the horizontal axis in the left panel, you have multidimensionally poor households, the poverty rate, and on the vertical axis, you see the extensive margin expansion, and this is sort of good news. It says the upward slope means that in poor districts, the NREGA has expanded even more. So that's good news. Okay, so I guess the punchline here is that the NREGA has been somewhat successful in mitigating the economic effects of the pandemic as far as especially urban-rural return migration is concerned. And I'm out of time. I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Stephen, for the detailed and extensive presentation on poverty in India. Already we are behind a hill. So for Professor Stephen, it is late night. So there are a number of questions raised by the participants during the registration. However, most of the questions are answered during your presentation and also Professor Stephen's presentation. So I will just pick two questions. So here the question that if you come across the recent work of Professor Danikwa, that is on inequality, and is no sufficient statistics cracks that the pandemic reveals, in which he measures the inequality or mobility and finds that inequality has declined in Singapore and China, while it has increased in the USA. So what's your take on this finding? So I'm wondering also like about from where Professor Danuka got the data for China. So it is, yeah, both of you can answer this question.
Well, I certainly,
yeah.
Well, I think Danny's work on distributional dynamics is is extremely interesting. The way that I might talk about these things is if you're thinking about Singapore, China, and the United States, these are fundamentally different societies. So I don't actually think there's any reason to think they would exhibit similar distributional dynamics. What I mean by that is that, in China, you have there's actually been an increase in the intergenerational elasticity of mobility from 0.3 to 0.4. According to most estimates, but that's against a background of economic growth becoming 10% a year, and so it's one thing to ask what Genie's or anything else are going to look like against dramatic economic growth. The United States, on the other hand, is a very old, maybe a new country comparatively speaking. It's an old economy. It's near its steady state, and so. One has to think about the distributional dynamics against the background of very modest growth, and there's many reasons to think that it's well documented. There's been a dramatic increase in inequality in the U.S. in the last 40 years. It partly derives from changes in the tax system. It derives from increases in educational inequality. There's a component that has to do with globalization. So I think, and then if you were to look at Singapore, that's an extremely interesting case in which there's massive government investments in many things that produce economic growth, be it infrastructure or human capital. So I think. The general comment I would make is I think they have to be you have to ask each in isolation, and there's nothing. I don't find any of it surprising in the sense there's completely different polities.
Yes, that. Yeah, Professor Stephen, you want to add something? Yeah, Professor Stephen, you are okay. So let's put the last question. That is on. What is the role of financial institutions in reducing inequality in the developed and developing countries? How the financial institutions can be more effective in tackling or handling inequality and poverty in the large developing country like India? The question is for both.
Well, I mean, I guess sort of being myself a microfinance researcher, financial inclusion's role for poverty reduction sort of is contested, but so the World Bank has it high on the agenda to improve financial inclusion, to connect poor households which are often subsisting on informal activities with a formal economy, and of course the financial sector is an important part of that. My impression is that India has been making great progress in that regard, especially over the last 10 years. So with many of the social programs like the NREGA, but now also maternity benefit schemes such as the PMMVY being distributed through bank accounts exclusively, has really massively increased the share of households holding bank accounts, at least. On the other hand, of course, poverty researchers like myself become concerned about such conditions, there is the danger that then you exclude the poorest of the poor. So those, for example, that for whatever reasons can't manage to get a bank account will also not have access to such programs any longer. And that creates a concern, especially sort of if we think of like moderately poor, for whom it's probably feasible to open bank accounts and become connected to the financial sector, and ultra poor people who may be moving around and migrating a lot and find it difficult to entertain relationship with a bank, so that those fall through the grids. And by the way, this seems a big problem and shortcoming of virtually all of these welfare programs in India, that outreach is far from perfect, and that my impression is that often it's the poorest that are not being reached by those programs, and the process of financial inclusion and forced financial inclusion could backfire in that regard. So that's broadly my opinion on that.
Yeah, well, Professor Stephen, want to add something to this question?
No, Stefan is the expert, so I thought he covered everything. I may add just one sentence, and that is, he brought up a very important issue, which is in talking about inequality. It's dangerous to focus too much on single statistics. There's a whole distribution, and so you can think about a policy that helps, as I said, kind of the moderately poor versus the extremely poor. And same thing with mobility. I made some derogatory comments about the state of intergenerational mobility in the U.S., but there's other that was looking at an overall population. If I talked about immigrants, you'd have an extremely different vision of how the U.S. is doing versus other very affluent places. And so, as I said, I just wanted to echo Stefan's observation about the heterogeneity of the answers to questions like that.
Okay, thank you. So, thank you, Professor Stephen and Professor Stephen, for making the inciting presentation. And I hope our participants are satisfied and benefited. So I request our director to give any remarks. It's over to you, sir. Director, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Jagannath. What else I can say? Two distinguished guests in the domain of academics. Actually, it has been a really enriching journey. And this platform is truly privileged to have them both. And the way they have gone through the detailed analysis and insight, it is mind-boggling. And especially Professor Stephen, the way he has done the micro studies of entire structure of Indian economy with all states. I belong to the state of Odisha and Bihar, everywhere. So this is something, it's really empowering, the entire process. So the detailed discussion and the way we have taken forward this international special lectures is what I can say. With the presence of these two, we can assure you that we have really been empowered. One. And second, to these two distinguished guests, we have got a standing invitation whenever they would visit India. I'll request, if they happen to be in Kolkata, please do visit our institute. That would be our request and the sincere desire also.
Oh, that's very kind.
Thank you very. Yeah. Thank you very much. And over to you, Mr. Jagannath.
So, thank you, sir. With this, kindly allow me to propose the vote of thanks. I take this opportunity to express my heartfelt thanks to distinguished speakers, Professor Stephen and Professor Stephen, for delivering the lecture. I want to extend thanks and bottom of my heart to Director Sir for the opening remarks. I also thank to our participants for making the event and the lecture series a huge success. I hope we'll take it forward. So there are also many other officials who are working for the successful conduct and arrangement of the event, including our DGM admin, IT and marketing department, broadcasting teams. I thank each of you. Also, I thank the SBIL members being present here today. So thank you all. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Stephen and Professor Stephen.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Stephen. Thank you, Professor Stephen.
Thank you again.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Professor Stephen. It is very late night for you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good morning to you. Good night for me.